Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bonnie Fernandez-Waslick, and I'm joined here today with Dr. Stephanie Masta from Purdue University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And so we're going to get right into another Curricular Byte session with Dr. Masta and with the question, what does it mean to engage in curriculum theorizing?
So I'm going to start with a story because I think a lot about well, one, right, like curriculum is everywhere. I early work was looking at social studies social studies curriculum, so social studies teachers, and the way that social studies teachers talk about kind of like early colonial America and colonization and things like that. And what I found after spending, hundreds and hundreds of hours in these social studies classrooms is that, not surprising, social studies teachers spend very little time talking about colonization. They spend a lot of time talking about the founding fathers, in a way that is almost, a fetishization, right? And I was working with a social studies teacher once, and he really loved the founding fathers, and in particular George Washington. Like, loved George Washington. And he was in class one day, and he was talking about how he kept saying how George Washington was unanimously elected as president. And I'm kind of like, and anytime I'm doing that kind of classroom work, if a teacher says something that I think, oh, that's probably not historically accurate, I make a little note to myself. And again, I was pretty sure that George Washington was selected as president, but we didn't have elections until a couple of presidents later. And but he kept saying, repeating this after class. And then he, at the end of the day, I'm wrapping up, and he said, do you have any questions? And I said, yeah, actually I do. I said, so you kept saying that George Washington was elected, but wasn't he selected? Like, we didn't have elections until, like, I think Jefferson. And he said, oh, yeah, no, like he was, and he kind of walks me through this process. And I said, okay, well, why didn't you tell the students that? And he said, well, it doesn't fit my narrative of what I want them to think about George Washington. And that struck me, one, right, around the historical kind of inaccuracy, but two, in that instant, I realized, I said, oh, this is part of the reason why when we try to have conversations as a community or as a politic or as a city around constitutional issues, that oftentimes people's understanding of the founding fathers, of the Constitution, really kind of rests with how they learned about it in eighth grade and perhaps 11th grade, depending on how your 11th grade, history or social studies teacher, like where they picked up, right? But like eighth grade social studies is typically like, contact to, right after the Civil War. And and I use that example in my curriculum when I teach curriculum theory. I use that example of how what we think as when we think of curriculum as a subject that we teach or something that we learn, that we fail to recognize how significant and important it is, because we take those curriculum lessons with us when we go out into the public. So when people talk about the founding fathers, right, they are often harkening back to how their social studies teachers thought about the founding fathers, right? When I think about curriculum theorizing, it helps us understand the who, the what, and the where, and why it's important for certain narratives to kind of be carried forward, and why these narratives carry forward. I think sometimes we stop at recognizing like the long term influence of the curriculum that we learn from, particularly in K through 12, and how that leads to, a group of people thinking that we can never question the Second Amendment, but it's perfectly fine for us to question the Fourth, right?
So I want to ask you about your work,
Yeah.
which has always been something that I've enjoyed engaging with. And
Thank you.
if you could talk a little bit about how do you define your scholarly contributions to the field? What are they? How have you come to them? Those kinds of things.
Most of my work is in curriculum studies is around Indigenous education, around settler colonialism. I think often that when folks are uncomfortable, they want to move to action. And I see this a lot in movement work. And so I feel that oftentimes when scholars or when curriculum studies scholars are uncomfortable with the whiteness or the maleness, that what they tend to do is they tend to go towards like these spaces of decolonization, right? But they are not sitting with the discomfort of like the space. And so I feel like one of my contributions is asking is pushing back on the way that decolonization has almost become like a form of DEI or a form of right, like where it's like, oh, okay, we're going to decolonize this, but not really engaging deeply with like what that means. And so I feel like I'm still pushing in that space.
We have one question left today, which is forward thinking and wondering what it is that you hope for the field in terms of the future of the field. What might that be?
I feel like I'm like, not a get off your lawn person, but I definitely recognize probably for the first time that I am of a generation of curriculum study scholars, and there is a new generation that's coming up. And my hope for the field is that there's less gatekeeping and that there's more opportunity for us to welcome in scholars who are doing incredible work. And for those of us where that work might look very different from how we conceptualize the field, but for us to still hold space for that.
We're going to wrap up for our time today. I want to thank you again
Great.
for taking the time to be with us. As a reminder to our
Yeah, thank
listeners,
you.
it's a curricular bytes or even a kilobyte because it's just the beginning of a journey. Dr. Masta's ideas that she works with and her scholarship is going to be listed both on my webpage and then in the description of this video. Please make sure you check out, read, engage with, sit with Dr. Masta's work as it continues to be central to what we do across fields. Thank you again very much for joining us today.
Thank you.